Welcome to EXP Express Notes on CIMA P3 Performance Strategy. Today we're going to talk about risk and internal control. Of course, the two issues are intimately connected to each other. And we're going to discuss some of the typical risks that are facing an organization and the risk management processes and internal controls that are related to such risks or in managing such risks. It is actually useful to look at CIMA's definition of risk management, particularly since it's sort of capturing the idea that risks are not simply something that have to be eliminated or avoided, but are a necessary part of life in order to achieve profit. In other words, if we look at risks being not simply as downside or bad things happening to the company, but are a necessary part of achieving profits, that they open the door to opportunities on the upside, then I think we capture this idea that the risks a company is, or an organization is exposed to, is kind of inevitable given the fact that the organization is trying to achieve an objective. That's really quite an important and profound idea in our understanding of risk. Let's look at a basic diagram of the sorts of risks which face a company. We look at this integrally, so we have enterprise risk, and on one side we break down the universe of risks broadly into operational risks and financial risks. On the operational side, this is something which these are categories that most people can identify with because they have to do with the everyday sorts of things that happen within companies with regard to systems breaking down, people possibly committing fraud perhaps, or making mistakes on the job, processes are somehow defective, events occur which may or not be beyond the control of the company itself, and of course general business risks relating to the markets that a company is exposed to, competitive situation, what the demand is for the product of the company, and so on. So one can see this as being kind of a catch-all kind of category, and operational risk is really traditionally many risks which are connected, if you will, connected to the operation of the assets of a company, or we could think of this as being oriented towards the asset side of the balance sheet. Whereas on the other side, financial risk, we would ordinarily think of, for example, credit risks and market price risks, gearing risk. This is related to the use of debt. So this is driven primarily by looking at the liability side of the balance sheet and how we structure our capital, how we finance ourselves as a business, and so on. We'll come back and talk about financial risks later. As you go through these different categories, try to link the type of risk that's defined here to your own business environments to better appreciate what it means if we were to look at the processes that are occurring within a company, for example, and were to come to some conclusions as to how well structured and performing those processes are from the standpoint of economy. In other words, being able to, for example, keep costs to a minimum, efficiency, being able to achieve a certain degree of productivity, and effectiveness. And by effectiveness we mean able to fulfill objectives. People risk is of course a very broad category as well, because the kinds of risks that are connected to people are almost as diverse as people themselves. And here we can think of all the problems connected to, or challenges better said, to the whole HR cycle in terms of recruitment and training of suitable human resources in quality and numbers, okay? We also want honest people to be recruited. We want to make sure that the morale is high in the business so as to reduce the risk that people will behave in a way which is inimical or not in the best interests of the company. Now, systems risk relates to things that one would ordinarily expect with regard to information systems, IT, the communications, infrastructure of the company, the reliability of backup systems, and all the issues relating to maintaining the integrity of the system, accuracy of inputs, access, and so on. So systems security. So that's also a broad area and an area for specialists. Then there are the risks which are characterized as being related to an event or a hazard, single events that may have very high or, on the other hand, a low impact. Here we would think of natural disasters, be earthquakes and so on, or human actions such as a terrorist attack which could have a debilitating effect on a business. Now, clearly there's some kind of fluidity in these categories, as one can see. For example, fraud can straddle or overlap two of these categories, because fraud would normally be associated with the things that people do and therefore could be regarded as a people risk. But of course, a major event of fraud needs to be seen as an event where we understand the interaction of perhaps defective systems and the opportunity for someone who's inclined to exploit an opportunity to commit fraud. So we have to take a very broad view of how we characterize these risks and understand where they come from and what the impact is across the organization. Finally, business risk is a very broad area. As mentioned before, it's kind of a catch-all category which really covers everything from a strategy of a company to political, legal environment. This could be regulatory issues that could threaten a company in terms of fulfilling its business mission profitably, and the whole gamut of products, marketing, clients, and so on, and of course not to forget reputation. Now, if we wanted to make a certain basic split here, we could say that the process, people, and systems risks could be seen as the kind of threats which are internal or the challenges facing the company. The other risks could be seen as being externally imposed. Now, it's worth appreciating at this point that at the level of international operations, the risks actually multiply. They become much more complex because as one expands one's business activities across different nations and continents, one has to take into account differing cultural norms, political stability, which can vary tremendously, and then, of course, the kinds of legal systems that one is confronted with. And by this, we're talking about not just the particular code of laws or system of laws which exist in a given country, but how well the judicial system works. Sometimes in many countries, people tell you, don't even think of trying to protect an interest in the courts, because you will wait too long and spend too much money before you get a judgment. So we need to understand, in some ways, the judicial system can be seen within the context of political stability or lack thereof, and of course cultural norms which obtain as well. And then of course the regulatory enforcement too. There are many other factors that we could mention when we discuss international operations. Key risk concepts, just keep in mind here what sort of concepts we're talking about. One is, when we talk about risks, it's the probability. This is a major concept. The likelihood that a certain event will occur. Probability. Very central to the idea of risk, because we can't say for certain what's going to happen in the future. When we've established what the probability could be of an event, we have to decide what the severity of the event will be. In other words, how bad is the impact if an undesired outcome were to occur? How badly, how much would it affect us? The intensity, the severity. Also, another dimension of risk is to understand how broadly or how narrowly we are exposed to it. So if there was a reasonably high probability of an event occurring, and if it were to occur, its severity in and of itself would be quite high, but we've elected to organize our affairs in such a way that our exposure is very low against this medium probability, high severity type of risk, then of course we've already taken steps to be able to cushion its impact on us. You can put all these factors together by saying that risk is effectively the product of probability times severity times exposure. And in some literature, this is also reduced to simply probability times the financial consequences. You can see here that severity times exposure would translate into the consequences, the financial magnitude of the impact on our organization. Volatility is another factor which enters into the picture because it's the variability or the dispersion of all likely outcomes. So volatility would imply that very high risks or very high losses or very low losses can swing greatly around a mean figure, and standard deviation is one statistical measure to capture the idea of volatility. Now, there are a number of tools and techniques in which we could organize our thinking about risks, and one of them is risk mapping. Now, risk mapping has to do with organizing on in 4 quadrants here how we would classify the risks that our business is faced with from the standpoint of severity, whether it's high or low severity, and also whether the likelihood of the risk occurring is high or low. And one can see here in the case of a low likelihood and a low severity, the amount of management time which is required is relatively or quite modest. In cases where the likelihood is on the high side but the severity is low, then it's a question of monitoring. On the other hand, if we think of a risk which is quite low, but if it does occur, its severity would be high. One could think, for example, in this case of plane accidents have a low likelihood, but when they do occur, the severity is high. Then it's a question of not simply monitoring, but a company, of course, needs to pay closer attention to the consequences here and, for example, prevent its entire senior management from flying in the same airplane. In other words, one would want to have key executives flying in different aircraft. And finally, in the case where one has high likelihood and high severity, then of course the priority should be focused on preventing the risk altogether. Thank you for listening.